The air inside the convention center crackled with anticipation. Red, white, and blue banners hung from the rafters, and campaign staff bustled around making last-minute adjustments to the stage. It was supposed to be a routine town hall meeting, another stop on the campaign trail where President Trump would field carefully vetted questions about veterans' affairs. The event organizers had selected attendees they believed would stick to the script, focusing on policy proposals rather than controversy. What they didn't know was that among the 200 veterans seated in the audience, one man had something else in mind. Anthony Wilson sat in the 7th row, his back straight, his decorated Army uniform pressed to perfection. 3 combat tours in Afghanistan had taught him patience. He could wait for his moment. Around him, other veterans chatted excitedly, some taking selfies, others discussing what questions they hoped would be addressed. Anthony remained quiet, occasionally glancing down at the small note card in his hand where he'd written his question, a question that had been burning inside him for years. "You nervous?" whispered the veteran seated beside him, an older man with silver hair who had served in Desert Storm. Anthony shook his head. "Not nervous, just ready." The lights dimmed slightly as the event director stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be live in 5 minutes. Please take your seats." The murmur of conversation faded as people settled in. Television cameras panned across the audience, capturing the faces of men and women who had served their country, now gathered to hear from their commander-in-chief. Behind the stage, President Trump reviewed his talking points with his staff. This event was important. Veterans represented a key voting bloc, and the latest polls showed he needed to strengthen his support among them. His team had prepared responses to the expected questions about VA healthcare, benefits, and transition programs. "Remember, sir, stick to the positives," his campaign manager advised. "Talk about the VA reform bill and the decrease in veteran unemployment." Trump nodded, though his mind seemed elsewhere. These events had become routine for him, almost too predictable. Part of him secretly hoped for something unexpected to break up the monotony. He was about to get exactly that. The moderator, a well-known news anchor, took the stage to enthusiastic applause. "Good evening and welcome to this special town hall meeting focused on issues affecting our nation's veterans." She explained the format. The president would make opening remarks, then take questions from selected audience members for approximately 45 minutes. When Trump walked onto the stage, the room erupted in a mix of cheers and polite applause. He waved, adjusting his red tie before taking his position at the podium. Thank you," he began, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "Our veterans are incredible people. The best people. Nobody respects our military more than I do, believe me." He continued with his prepared remarks, highlighting his administration's accomplishments and promising continued support for those who had served. Anthony listened carefully, his expression revealing nothing. The uniform he wore, the same one he'd worn on his final day of service, felt heavier than usual. The weight of his medals earned in combat reminded him of everything he had given for his country. Yet since returning home 4 years ago, he had faced battles of a different kind. After 15 minutes of remarks, the moderator opened the floor for questions. A veteran in the 3rd row was handed a microphone first. He asked about improvements to the GI Bill. Trump responded with confidence, citing figures and legislation. The second question came from a woman who had served as a nurse in Iraq. She inquired about mental health services. Again, Trump gave a practiced response about increasing funding and access. 3 more veterans asked questions, all polite, all straightforward, all receiving predictable answers. The event was proceeding exactly as planned. Then the moderator announced, "Our next question comes from Anthony Wilson, U.S. Army, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan." A production assistant carried the microphone to Anthony's row. He stood, his 6'2" frame commanding attention. The spotlight found him, illuminating his dark brown skin and the impressive array of medals on his chest, including a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. The room fell quiet. Something about his presence, his dignity, his calm intensity, made everyone pay attention. "Thank you, Mr. President," Anthony began, his deep voice steady. "I served our country for 12 years. I led men into combat. I watched friends die defending the ideals of freedom and equality." Trump nodded respectfully. This seemed like the beginning of many veteran stories he'd heard before. But then Anthony continued, "Since coming home, I've experienced something that has troubled me deeply. Despite my service record, despite my sacrifices, I've faced obstacles and prejudices that my white counterparts haven't. And I'm not alone in this experience." The moderator shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't one of the pre-approved questions. A producer spoke urgently into her earpiece. Anthony held up the statistics he'd printed. Black veterans experience higher rates of homelessness, receive fewer job callbacks despite identical resumes, and face disparities in healthcare treatment at VA facilities. "These are documented facts, sir." The audience grew tense. Some veterans nodded in recognition. Others looked uncomfortable. The television cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment for millions of viewers watching live across the country. Trump's expression changed subtly. His media training had prepared him for hostile questions, but something about the dignified way Anthony spoke, without anger or accusation, just a calm stating of his truth, made this different. "I'm not here to attack you, Mr. President," Anthony continued. "I'm here because I believe you when you say you care about veterans. All veterans." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I need to know what specific policies you would implement to address these disparities that affect veterans of color like myself." The silence that followed was electric. The question wasn't just about veterans' issues anymore. It touched on race, on equality, on the American promise itself. Secret Service agents along the walls maintained their professional composure, but their attention heightened. The moderator looked toward the campaign staff off stage, clearly wondering if she should intervene. What no one expected was what happened next. President Trump, known for his quick, often defensive responses to challenging questions, did something unusual. He didn't immediately reach for the microphone. He didn't launch into a prepared talking point. Instead, he looked directly at Anthony for a long moment. The cameras caught his expression, not anger or defensiveness, but something that appeared to be genuine consideration. "Can we get this gentleman a chair up here?" Trump finally said, gesturing to the stage. "I want to hear more about this." The audience murmured in surprise. This wasn't how these events were supposed to go. The campaign staff exchanged alarmed glances. The network producers, sensing something unprecedented unfolding, directed their cameras to capture every angle of this unexpected development. Anthony remained standing, momentarily confused. Was this a dismissive gesture? A political tactic? Or something sincere? "I'm serious," Trump continued, waving away an aide who approached to whisper something in his ear. "I want to hear what he has to say." Not just a question, but his experience. The American people should hear this too. The moderator, recovering her professional poise, addressed the audience. "It seems the president would like to have a more in-depth conversation. Mr. Wilson, would you be willing to come to the stage?" Anthony nodded once, handing his note card to the veteran beside him. As he made his way toward the aisle, other veterans reached out, patting his shoulder or offering quiet words of encouragement. The walk to the stage felt longer than any patrol he'd ever led in Afghanistan. Every eye was on him, the audience, the cameras, the President of the United States. But Anthony had faced fear before. He'd made decisions under enemy fire. This moment, however unexpected, was why he had come. As a production assistant hurriedly brought a chair to the stage, positioning it near the president, Anthony climbed the steps with the same dignity that had carried him through 12 years of military service. No one in the audience could have predicted this turn of events. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated campaign event had suddenly transformed into something raw and real, a moment of potential reckoning between a black veteran and the president. And as Anthony took his seat on the stage, with millions watching from home, the nation held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The production team scrambled to adjust the lighting and camera angles. This wasn't in the script. The campaign staff huddled together off stage, their concerned whispers barely audible over the low murmur of the crowd. One of them made a slicing motion across his throat, cut the feed, but the network producer shook her head. This was live television. They couldn't stop it now. Anthony sat upright in the chair that had been hastily placed near the president. Despite the unexpected turn of events, his military training kept him composed. His hands rested calmly on his knees, his expression serious but not confrontational. The stage lights felt warm on his face. President Trump turned toward him, their chairs now facing each other. For a moment, neither man spoke. The audience waited in tense silence. Even the Secret Service agents, typically stoic, seemed to hold their breath. "First," Trump said, breaking the silence, "I want to thank you for your service." His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the bombastic tone he typically used at rallies. 3 tours in Afghanistan, that's something. That's really something. Anthony nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Trump leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about what happened when you came home. Not the talking points, not what someone told you to say, just your experience." The moderator, unsure of her role in this unscripted moment, stood awkwardly to the side. The teleprompters displayed prepared responses to anticipated questions, none of which applied to this situation. Anthony took a deep breath. The convention center was so quiet he could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "When I left the Army after 12 years, he began, "I thought the transition would be straightforward. I had leadership experience, technical skills, discipline, but I quickly discovered there were additional challenges." He described applying for 19 jobs before receiving a single interview, despite his qualifications. He recounted a VA hospital visit where his pain complaints were dismissed until a white veteran friend intervened. He talked about being followed in stores while wearing his service cap, about neighbors who were friendly until they saw his face, about the invisible weight he carried not just as a veteran, but as a black veteran. "The hardest part," Anthony said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion behind his words, "was explaining to my 10-year-old son why some people still judge me by my skin color instead of this uniform or what it represents." Throughout Anthony's account, Trump did something unusual for him. He listened without interrupting. The cameras caught his expression shifting, his famous confidence giving way to what appeared to be genuine contemplation. When Anthony finished, Trump remained silent for several seconds, seemingly processing what he'd heard. The audience stayed remarkably quiet, aware they were witnessing something rare in American politics, an unscripted, human exchange about one of the nation's most challenging issues. "You know," Trump finally said, "I've talked about veterans a lot, but I've never heard it put quite that way." He glanced toward his staff offstage, then back to Anthony. "And that's a problem, isn't it? That I haven't heard it?" This acknowledgement, so different from the defensive responses many had expected, caused a ripple of murmurs through the audience. Trump continued, "Let me ask you something, and I want an honest answer. What's the one thing that you think I don't understand about your experience? The biggest thing I'm missing?" The campaign manager visibly winced. This was dangerous territory, politically speaking, uncharted waters, but Trump seemed genuinely interested in the answer. Anthony considered the question carefully. "I think, sir, what you might not fully understand is that for veterans like me, our battle doesn't end when we come home. We fight for our country overseas, then we come back and fight to be fully recognized by it. Every day." Trump nodded slowly. "That's not right. That's not how it should be." He stood suddenly and walked to the edge of the stage, looking out at the audience filled with veterans. "How many of you have had experiences similar to what he's describing?" Hands began to rise, first just a few, then more. Black veterans, Hispanic veterans, Asian veterans, Native American veterans, perhaps 30 hands in all. Trump turned back to Anthony. "This isn't a political issue. This shouldn't be political at all. A veteran is a veteran." He returned to his chair and leaned in, his voice lower, though the microphone still picked it up. "Here's what I want to know. What would you do? If you were sitting where I am, what would you do about this?" The question seemed to catch Anthony by surprise. He had come prepared to challenge the president, not to be challenged by him in return. "3 things," Anthony said after collecting his thoughts. "First, direct the VA to conduct a full audit of treatment disparities and address them systematically. Second, create incentives for companies that hire veterans of color at the same rates as their white counterparts. And third," he paused, gathering courage for his boldest suggestion, "establish a presidential commission on veteran equality, led by veterans of color themselves." As he outlined each point, Anthony's confidence grew. This wasn't just about airing grievances, he was offering solutions. Trump listened, occasionally nodding. When Anthony finished, Trump turned to an aide. "Do we have something like this already? A commission like he's talking about?" The aide shook her head. Trump turned back to Anthony. "Why not?" "That seems like something we should have." The audience stirred. This wasn't the response many had expected. Social media was already exploding, with clips of the exchange being shared faster than commentators could analyze them. Trump continued, "Look, I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you've been through. I haven't walked in your shoes. But I am going to do something about what I'm hearing tonight." He turned to face the audience and the cameras. "This is what these town halls should be about. Real people, real issues, real talk. Not the scripted stuff." He gestured dismissively toward the teleprompters. The moderator, sensing a potential return to structure, stepped forward. "Mr. President, should we continue with the scheduled questions?" Trump waved her off. "In a minute." He turned back to Anthony. "I want to do something concrete about this. Not just talk. I've got people who can help set up this commission you mentioned, but I want you involved. Would you be willing to help?" Anthony's expression remained measured, though a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Yes, sir. I would." "Good," Trump said, extending his hand. They shook, and something about the genuineness of the moment, two men from vastly different backgrounds finding unexpected common ground, resonated with everyone watching. As they continued talking, the conversation expanded to include specific policies and programs. Trump called over his Veterans Affairs Secretary, who had been sitting in the front row, to join them on stage. What had begun as a confrontation was evolving into a substantive discussion about real changes. In the press section, journalists typed frantically on their laptops. Cable news chyrons changed from "Veteran confronts Trump" to "Unexpected dialogue on race and veterans issues." The town hall had been scheduled for 90 minutes. The unplanned conversation between the president and Anthony stretched to nearly 30 minutes, an eternity in television time. Network executives, initially alarmed by the deviation from the script, now directed their teams not to cut away. Viewership numbers were climbing as word spread about what was happening. In living rooms across America, people who had tuned in expecting typical campaign rhetoric found themselves watching something different, something that felt authentic in a way political events rarely did. "I think we've taken enough time," Anthony eventually said, aware of the other veterans waiting to ask their questions. Trump nodded. "Maybe, but this was important." He addressed the audience again. "Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones you don't plan for." As Anthony stood to return to his seat, Trump stood as well. "I want you to give me your contact information before you leave tonight. My team will be in touch about that commission idea." "I mean it." Anthony nodded, recognizing the significance of what had just occurred. "Thank you, Mr. President." As he walked back to his seat, veterans reached out to pat his shoulder or shake his hand. Some whispered "thank you" as he passed. The moderator returned to her position, visibly relieved to be back on familiar ground. "We'll now continue with our scheduled questions." But everyone in that convention center and the millions watching at home knew something had fundamentally changed. For a brief moment, the carefully constructed walls of political theater had fallen away, revealing the possibility of genuine dialogue about one of the nation's most persistent challenges. As the town hall resumed its planned format, phones throughout the audience lit up with notifications. The exchange between the president and the veteran was already going viral, crossing political lines, starting conversations, and Anthony, back in his seat in the 7th row, knew that regardless of what policy changes might or might not follow, something significant had happened on that stage. He had been seen. He had been heard. And in that moment, the nation had been reminded of what was possible when people truly listened to one another. The town hall continued for another 40 minutes, but the energy in the room had shifted. The remaining questions about healthcare access, job training programs, and housing assistance all seemed to carry a new weight after Anthony's exchange with the president. Veterans of different backgrounds stood to speak, many referencing what they had just witnessed, some sharing their own experiences of both service and struggle. When the event finally ended, the crowd lingered, breaking into small discussion groups rather than rushing for the exits. Campaign staffers huddled with communication directors, frantically revising press statements. Network producers extended their coverage, bringing in commentators to analyze what many were already calling a defining moment in the campaign. Anthony found himself surrounded as he tried to make his way toward the door. Veterans wanted to share their stories. Journalists called out questions. A member of the president's advance team approached, asking him to wait as the president wanted a word before leaving. "You've started something important," said an older veteran, gripping Anthony's hand firmly. "Thank you for saying what many of us couldn't find the words for." 20 minutes later, Anthony was escorted to a small holding room behind the stage. Secret Service agents stood outside the door, their expressions unreadable. Inside, President Trump was hunched over a desk, scribbling notes on a legal pad while two advisors spoke in hushed tones nearby. Trump looked up when Anthony entered. "There he is," he said, rising from his chair. The advisors fell silent. "Thank you for waiting," Trump said. "I wanted to talk for another minute before all the political machinery takes over." He gestured dismissively toward his team. "They're already worried about how to manage what happened out there. But I don't want to manage it. I want to build on it." He handed Anthony a business card. "This has my secretary's direct line. Call tomorrow morning. We're going to set up that commission, and I want you involved from the beginning." Anthony accepted the card. "Thank you, Mr. President, but I have to ask, why me?" "There are veterans organizations with more resources, more connections." Trump considered the question. "Because you didn't come to score political points. You came with truth." He paused. "And because sometimes the right person for something is just the right person. My gut tells me you're serious about making things better, not just complaining about problems." The meeting lasted only a few minutes more, ending with another handshake, this one away from the cameras, but somehow more meaningful than the one on stage. As Anthony finally left the convention center, the evening air felt cool on his face. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended skyward. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls from friends who had seen him on television. He silenced it, needing a moment to process everything that had happened. He drove home in silence, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. What had started as a personal mission to be heard, to speak truth to power, had unexpectedly transformed into something larger. There would be expectations now, responsibilities, and scrutiny. The lights were still on when he pulled into his driveway. His wife Lisa stood in the doorway, their 10-year-old son Thomas peering around her legs despite the late hour. "Dad, you're famous," Thomas exclaimed, holding up his tablet. "You're all over the internet." Lisa's expression was more measured, proud but also concerned. She knew better than anyone the cost of standing up, of becoming visible. "Come inside," she said. "You must be exhausted." Inside their modest living room, the television was tuned to a news channel where a panel of commentators analyzed the town hall. Anthony's face appeared in a side box as they debated the significance of what had transpired. "A remarkable departure from the usual campaign script," one analyst was saying. "But is it genuine?" Another countered. "Or just political theater?" Lisa muted the television. "Are you okay?" Anthony nodded slowly. "I think so." "It didn't go how I expected. Was he listening? Really listening?" "I think he was," Anthony said, surprising himself with his own assessment. At least in that moment, Thomas bounced on the couch. "Dad, my teacher sent a message saying we're going to talk about what happened in social studies tomorrow. Can I tell everyone you're my dad?" Despite his fatigue, Anthony smiled. "Yes, you can." Later that night, after Thomas had finally gone to bed, Anthony and Lisa sat on their back porch. The neighborhood was quiet, but Anthony's phone continued to light up with notifications. News outlets requesting interviews, veterans sharing stories, old friends reconnecting after seeing him on television. "What happens now?" Lisa asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Tomorrow morning I call the number he gave me," Anthony said, "and we see if he meant what he said, and if he didn't." Anthony was silent for a moment. "Then at least we tried. At least we spoke up." As they talked into the night, news of the town hall confrontation, now being called the conversation on social media, continued to spread. Hashtags formed, video clips accumulated millions of views. Commentators from across the political spectrum weighed in. Some called it a cynical political stunt. Others hailed it as a breakthrough moment of authenticity. Veterans groups issued statements of support. Activists expressed cautious optimism. Politicians from both parties scrambled to position themselves in relation to what had occurred. By morning, the story had evolved beyond the initial exchange to questions about what would happen next. Would there really be a presidential commission? Would concrete policies emerge? Or would the moment fade as so many moments of apparent progress had before? Anthony woke early before the sun had fully risen. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the business card the president had given him. The direct line to the White House secretary. A portal to possibility, or perhaps to disappointment. His phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "This is David Reynolds, Deputy Chief of Staff to the President. He mentioned you would be calling this morning. I've been instructed to begin the process of establishing the commission discussed yesterday. Please call when convenient." Anthony read the message twice, confirming it was real. Then he showed it to Lisa, who had joined him at the table. "They're actually following through," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "So far," Anthony cautioned. "We'll see what happens next." He made the call an hour later once he knew the White House offices would be open. The conversation was brief but substantive. The president had directed his staff to draft an executive order establishing the commission. They wanted Anthony's input on the language, the scope, and recommendations for who should serve. The president specifically mentioned that he wants veterans of color in leadership roles, Reynolds explained. He was quite clear about that. After the call ended, Anthony sat in silence for several minutes. 24 hours earlier, he had been preparing to ask a question at a town hall, hoping merely to be heard. Now he was helping to shape a presidential initiative. The doorbell rang, breaking his reverie. Lisa answered it, then called to him. "Anthony, there's someone here from NBC News. They want an interview." He joined her at the door. The reporter, a young woman with a cameraman behind her, smiled hopefully. "Mr. Wilson, we'd like to get your thoughts on what happened last night and what comes next. People are calling it a turning point. Would you be willing to share your perspective?" Anthony considered the request. Part of him wanted to retreat into privacy, to process everything away from public view. But he also recognized that visibility mattered, that this unexpected moment of connection could easily be forgotten without continued engagement. "Yes," he said finally, "but not about politics. About veterans, about people trying to be seen as full Americans after serving their country. If that's the conversation you want to have, I'm willing to talk." The reporter nodded. "That's exactly the conversation people want to have right now." As the camera crew set up in his living room, Anthony thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a young man joining the army, to a soldier in Afghanistan, to a veteran fighting different battles at home, to this moment, amplifying not just his own voice, but the voices of thousands who had walked similar paths. He didn't know if the commission would create lasting change. He didn't know if the president's interest would sustain beyond the initial positive press. He didn't know if the country was truly ready for the honest conversation that had begun in that convention center. But he did know that something had shifted in the national dialogue, in the president's understanding, and in his own sense of purpose. A door had opened, however slightly, and he was determined to keep it from closing. The weeks following the town hall moved at a dizzying pace. Anthony's life, once structured by the predictable rhythm of his job as a logistics manager, now revolved around conference calls, media appearances, and meetings with veterans groups. His employer granted him a temporary leave of absence after the White House officially requested his consultation on the newly formed Presidential Commission on Veteran Equality. 2 weeks after the town hall, Anthony found himself walking through the gates of the White House, passing through security checkpoints that reminded him of military installations overseas. The grandeur of the building contrasted sharply with the seriousness of the work ahead. In the Roosevelt Room, 12 people sat around a polished table, 6 veterans of color selected for their diverse experiences and expertise, along with officials from Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, and the White House staff. Anthony, to his surprise, had been named interim chairperson of the commission. "The president will join us shortly," announced Reynolds, the deputy chief of staff who had been Anthony's main point of contact. "He's been following your preliminary work closely." The commission had already begun identifying key areas for investigation: disparities in VA healthcare treatment, barriers to employment, housing discrimination, and mental health resources. Each commissioner brought personal experiences that highlighted systemic issues. The Army veteran from Detroit who had been denied pain medication that was readily prescribed to white veterans. The Navy veteran from New Mexico, whose security clearance reviews had been inexplicably longer and more invasive than those of her colleagues. the Marine from Oklahoma whose tribal status complicated his access to benefits. When President Trump entered the room, everyone stood. He waved them back to their seats, less formal than during official functions. "I've been reading your initial reports," Trump said, taking a seat at the table rather than at the head. "Some of this is worse than I thought." "Much worse." He turned to the VA secretary. "Is it true about the pain management disparities? Black veterans being less likely to receive medication?" The secretary nodded uncomfortably. "The data supports those findings, sir. We've known about the issue but haven't addressed it systematically." Trump shook his head. "Not acceptable. Not for people who serve this country." He turned to Anthony. "What else are we missing?" For the next hour, the president listened as commissioners outlined their findings. He asked questions, occasionally expressing frustration at bureaucratic explanations from the government officials present. "I don't want to hear why it's complicated," he said at one point. "I want to hear how we fix it." By the end of the meeting, the president had authorized an executive order requiring the VA to implement immediate changes to address racial disparities in healthcare. He also directed his staff to prepare legislation that would create stronger incentives for companies hiring veterans of color. As the meeting concluded, Trump pulled Anthony aside. "You're doing good work here," he said, "and I'm learning things I should have known a long time ago." He paused. "Not everyone in Washington is happy about this commission. You know that, right?" Anthony nodded. He'd already experienced the resistance. The political operatives who saw the commission as an unnecessary distraction, the commentators who questioned his qualifications, the social media trolls attacking his character. "There are people on both sides who don't want this to succeed," Trump continued. "They prefer the fighting, the division. It's easier than solving problems." He fixed Anthony with a direct gaze. "Don't let them stop you." After leaving the White House, Anthony took a detour before heading to the airport. He walked the short distance to the Lincoln Memorial, needing a moment to process everything before returning home. Sitting on the steps, watching tourists move about the National Mall, he checked his phone. Another round of news alerts about the commission. Some positive, some skeptical. His social media mentions were a battlefield of praise and criticism from people who had never met him, but felt entitled to judge his every move. A text from Lisa provided welcome perspective. "Thomas got an A on his history project about you and the president. His teacher said it was the most engaged she's ever seen him. We're proud of you. Come home safe." Home had become both a sanctuary and a challenge. Reporters occasionally staked out their street. Neighbors were supportive but curious, sometimes treating Anthony like a celebrity rather than the same person they'd known for years. Thomas faced questions at school, some innocent, others reflective of the polarized reactions to his father's new role. "Dad, Jimmy's father said you're being used for politics," Thomas had reported one evening. "What does that mean?" These moments were the hardest, trying to explain complex adult realities to a child while preserving his innocence and optimism. "It means," Anthony had answered carefully, "that when people try to make things better, other people sometimes question their reasons. But what matters is whether good things happen in the end." 3 months after the town hall, the commission released its first comprehensive report, a detailed analysis of disparities facing veterans of color, with specific policy recommendations for addressing them. The report received bipartisan support from several key lawmakers, though others dismissed it as identity politics or unnecessary special treatment. The president, to the surprise of many political observers, embraced the findings publicly. At a press conference in the Rose Garden, with commissioners standing behind him, he announced executive actions implementing several of the recommendations immediately. "These men and women served America," Trump declared, gesturing to the veterans behind him. "Every one of them deserves the full measure of respect and opportunity this country has to offer. No exceptions. No excuses." Critics called it a political calculation, an attempt to broaden his appeal before the election. Supporters hailed it as evidence of genuine growth. The truth, as Anthony had come to understand, was more complicated than either narrative suggested. In private conversations, he had witnessed the president's genuine anger at the injustices documented by the commission. He had also observed the political calculations, the concern with optics and messaging. Both could exist simultaneously. the authentic response and the political awareness. One didn't necessarily negate the other. 6 months into the commission's work, Anthony received an unexpected call while driving home from a veterans outreach event in a neighboring state. "Anthony, it's the president." Trump rarely called directly, usually communicating through staff. Anthony pulled over to take the call. "Yes, Mr. President?" "I'm calling about Thomas," Trump said, surprising him further. "My staff tells me he's having a rough time at school because of all this. Kids can be cruel." Anthony's grip tightened on the phone. Thomas had indeed faced increasing teasing and isolation as the commission's work became more prominent and polarizing. Some parents had instructed their children not to play with the son of that political guy on TV. "He's handling it," Anthony said, protective of his son's privacy, even with the president. "We're handling it as a family." "I respect that," Trump replied. "But I'd like to help if I can. I'm visiting the Air Force Academy next week. Thomas might enjoy seeing the planes, meeting the cadets. Bring him along. No cameras, no press. Just a kid getting a cool experience because his father is doing important work." The gesture, unexpected and seemingly genuine, caught Anthony off guard. "That's very kind, sir. I'll talk to Thomas and Lisa about it." "Good, and Anthony? The new VA protocols you recommended, they're working. Early data shows more equitable pain management practices across all facilities where they've been implemented. Real change. That's because of you." After the call ended, Anthony sat in his car for several minutes. The work was far from finished. The commission faced ongoing resistance. Progress came in frustrating increments rather than sweeping transformations. But something was changing. Policies were shifting. Conversations were happening that hadn't happened before. Veterans who had suffered in silence were finding their voices. As he pulled back onto the road toward home, Anthony thought about the upcoming Air Force Academy visit. Thomas would be thrilled. He had developed a fascination with military aircraft during Anthony's deployments, a way of feeling connected to his father. More importantly, the invitation suggested something Anthony had wondered about since that first conversation at the town hall. The president's interest wasn't just political theater. Something real had taken root that night. An unexpected connection, a willingness to listen and learn, a commitment that had sustained beyond the cameras and the initial media attention. Anthony didn't harbor illusions about politics or human nature. He knew that progress could be reversed, that attention would eventually shift elsewhere, that the deep-rooted problems they were addressing wouldn't be solved in a single presidential term. But he also knew that sometimes, rarely but significantly, unexpected moments of genuine human connection could create ripples that turned into waves. The conversation that had begun that night at the town hall was still continuing, still expanding, still creating possibility. And for now, that was enough to keep moving forward. 1 year after the town hall, Anthony stood at the podium in the East Room of the White House. Behind him, large screens displayed data visualizations showing the commission's accomplishments, graphs trending upward for veteran employment, charts showing more equitable healthcare outcomes, maps of new resource centers in underserved communities. The room was filled with veterans, lawmakers, media, and advocates. In the front row sat Lisa and Thomas, dressed in their best clothes, pride evident in their expressions. Beside them, unexpectedly, was President Trump himself, who had insisted on attending as a participant rather than the central figure. "When we began this work," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the grandeur of the setting, "many people told us change wasn't possible. The barriers were too entrenched, the politics too divisive, the problems too complex." He paused, surveying the room. Those people were wrong. Over the past year, the Presidential Commission on Veteran Equality had transformed from a symbolic gesture into a force for substantial change. 17 policy directives had been implemented. 4 pieces of bipartisan legislation had been passed. Funding had been allocated for targeted outreach programs. Most importantly, awareness had grown among government officials, healthcare providers, employers, and the public. This journey began with a conversation, Anthony continued. A moment when someone in power chose to listen rather than defend. When truth was allowed to speak to power, and power actually heard it. He glanced toward the president, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. But the real heroes of this story aren't on this stage. They're the thousands of veterans who shared their experiences, who trusted us with their stories, who believed change was possible even when history suggested otherwise. The Commission's work had not been without challenges. Political opposition had been fierce at times. Funding battles had been exhausting. Some recommendations had been watered down in implementation. Anthony himself had faced personal attacks, his motives questioned, his background scrutinized. Through it all, however, the core work had continued. Real people had experienced real benefits. The VA had instituted new training programs to address implicit bias in healthcare. Major corporations had created targeted hiring initiatives for veterans of color. Community organizations had received grants to provide culturally responsive mental health services. This work isn't finished, Anthony said, approaching his conclusion. It may never be finished. But something has fundamentally changed in how we approach these issues. We've moved from denial to acknowledgement, from silence to conversation, from inaction to progress. As Anthony stepped away from the podium, the president rose to join him. The two men shook hands, a gesture that had become familiar over countless meetings but still carried symbolic weight. "I want to say something off script," Trump said, taking the microphone. The press pool leaned forward, alert for an unplanned presidential moment. "A year ago, I thought I understood veterans' issues. I'd signed bills, visited bases, talked the talk." He paused. "I was wrong. There was a whole dimension of experience I hadn't bothered to see." The room was silent. Reporters frantically taking notes at this rare admission from a president known for projecting certainty. This commission wasn't just about changing policies. It changed me. Trump looked directly at Anthony. "Thank you for that uncomfortable truth. Sometimes that's exactly what we need." Later, at the reception following the presentation, Anthony found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Veterans shared stories of how the Commission's work had affected their lives. Lawmakers discussed next steps for pending legislation. Media requested interviews about the Commission's future. Through it all, Anthony observed the president moving through the crowd, engaged in conversations that would have seemed unlikely a year earlier. The political calculation was still there. This was Washington, after all. But something else had emerged alongside it. A genuine interest, a willingness to learn, a respect for experiences different from his own. As the event wound down, Anthony found a quiet moment with Lisa and Thomas in a corner of the room. "Are we going home now?" Thomas asked, tugging at the collar of his dress shirt. "Soon," Anthony promised, "but there's someone I'd like you to meet first." He led them to where the president was speaking with a group of veterans. Trump noticed their approach and excused himself from the conversation. "This must be the famous Thomas," Trump said, extending his hand to the boy. "Your dad talks about you all the time." Thomas, usually talkative, suddenly found himself speechless. "I heard you're interested in aircraft," Trump continued. "Did you enjoy the Air Force Academy tour?" Thomas nodded vigorously. "The F-35 simulator was awesome. Dad said maybe I could be a pilot someday." "I'd bet on that," Trump said with unexpected gentleness. "This country needs people like you and your father." The brief exchange lasted only a few minutes, but Anthony saw something in it that reflected the larger journey of the past year. The power of human connection across differences, the possibility of growth and change, the hope represented by a child seeing new possibilities for his future. As they finally left the White House, the evening sky was painted in shades of purple and orange. Thomas ran ahead down the path, still energized despite the long day. Lisa took Anthony's hand. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have survived this year without you holding things together at home." "That's not what I mean," Lisa said. "You showed Thomas something important, that speaking up matters, that change is possible, that his future doesn't have to be limited by other people's assumptions." Anthony considered her words as they walked. The past year had transformed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined that night at the town hall. He had testified before Congress, appeared on national news programs, spoken at universities and veterans gatherings across the country. His perspective had been sought by policymakers who had never before considered the unique challenges faced by veterans of color. There had been costs as well. Their privacy had been compromised. Old friends had sometimes pulled away, uncomfortable with his new public role. The constant travel and stress had taken a toll on his health and family time. Not everyone had appreciated his willingness to work with a controversial president, regardless of the positive outcomes. Yet watching Thomas run ahead, imagining new possibilities for himself, Anthony felt certain that the journey had been worthwhile. 2 weeks later, Anthony sat in his home office reviewing the Commission's next phase recommendations. His phone buzzed with a text message from one of his fellow commissioners. "Turn on the news. The President just announced full funding for our education initiative." Anthony switched on the television. There was the President at a press conference, fielding questions about the newly allocated funds for scholarship programs, specifically targeting veterans of color seeking higher education. This program was one of the Commission's top recommendations, Trump was saying. "It's about making sure every veteran has the same opportunities when they come home, regardless of background." A reporter asked if the initiative was a response to criticism from political opponents about his record on race. The President's expression hardened slightly. "This isn't about politics. It's about keeping our promises to the men and women who served this country. If you want to make it political, that's on you. I'm focused on results." Anthony smiled slightly at the response. The President was still the President, combative, defensive at times, politically aware. But something had shifted in how he approached these particular issues. The conversation that began that night at the town hall had created ripples that continued to spread. Later that evening, as Anthony helped Thomas with a school project, his phone rang with an unknown number. "Mr. Wilson? This is Grace Chen. I served in the Army, 2 tours in Iraq." Anthony didn't recognize the name. "How can I help you, Grace?" "I'm calling because—" Her voice caught briefly. "I saw you on television talking about the Commission's work. I've been struggling since coming home. Feeling invisible, not getting the care I need, not knowing where to turn." She paused, gathering herself. "Seeing someone who understands, who's actually making changes happen, it gave me hope for the first time in years. I just wanted to say thank you." After the call ended, Anthony sat quietly for a long moment. Among the policy victories, the White House events, the media attention, and political battles, it was these moments that mattered most. One veteran finding hope, one family seeing new possibilities, one conversation opening the door to change. What had begun as a confrontation had become a conversation, and that conversation had grown into a movement. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And in a world where cynicism often prevailed, where division was easier than connection, where words rarely led to action, that was something worth celebrating. Thomas looked up from his project. "Dad, are you okay?" Anthony smiled at his son. "Yes, I'm just thinking about how sometimes when you speak your truth, amazing things can happen. Even if you're scared?" Thomas asked. "Especially then," Anthony said. "That's when it matters most."